Hello, folks. I'm not going to talk much about the Labour Party. It's not really much to say, is there? Let's face it. I'll talk rather, I think what I want to do with my little section here is talk about some of the work that Reinvestigate 9/11 has been doing behind the scenes, and I've been doing behind the scenes. I'll mention with Ian and myself, we went to meet with a contact that we have in the British Army a few years ago now. And we had a wide range. He'd originally contacted my colleague Tony Gosling because he had been a Freemason, and then he'd fallen out with them and they'd made his life a misery. So he'd contacted us because he knew we were interested in those kind of topics. So that's how we first made contact with him. I won't give you his name because you'll understand why. And we had a chat with him, and I remember we'd taken 7 copies of Ian's book, and we had a fairly long discussion over a few beers. And at the end of it, he said, right guys, I want 5 copies of your book. And he said, tomorrow morning, I'm going to put one of each, I don't want 6 copies or 4, I want 5. He said, because he was a staff officer, and he said, I'm going to put those books on the desk of a general tomorrow morning. Each book will go onto the desk of a British Army general. And I will say to that British Army general, whatever you do, sir, don't read that. And he said, that's all I can do for you. And I said, that will do for now. Okay, the other piece of information I want to communicate with you is that very recently I've been approached by a former British Army psychological warfare officer. He used to be a psychological warfare officer. He now works independently as a psychological warfare officer for the corporate world. Imagine, he says, I get paid £1,000 a day to do this now. The Army never used to pay me that. And basically what he does, he said to us, well, I go around the world fixing elections. That's what I do. And anyway, but he's definitely, he looked us up because he'd seen my colleague Tony Gosling on Russia Today. So he wanted people, he's making a film about psychological warfare, the mechanisms of it, which should come out in the autumn. And the title, the provisional title is Don't Shoot the Messenger. And I think he's thinking of me and Tony as the messengers, so I'm rather glad that they aren't thinking of shooting us, perhaps. But anyway, he's already got interviews with Alistair Campbell, Tim Bell of Bell Pottinger, senior military people, and we are going to be in that film with them, and it's going to be a critique of the whole psychological warfare game. He's basically potentially one of us, but also one of them. So one of the things we do as Reinvestigate is we can't always talk about these things openly, but I'm giving you a report on what we're doing behind the scenes. Now, the other thing I want to bring up is I've also been approached over the last 2 years, and I'm in very close contact with somebody who used to be involved in the arms trade. And he is giving us inside information, which I'm checking out, and it all checks out. In the early 90s, South Africa had 10 nuclear weapons, uranium bombs, which they developed with the Israelis at Pelindaba in South Africa. One of them was exploded in the South Atlantic in the early 80s, so there were 9 weapons left. It's like 10 green bottles. 10 green bottles? One went down. So there were 9 left. And as there was a transfer of power going on in South Africa in the early 90s, the Magnus Milan and others, John Bredenkamp, who's actually an arms dealer, approached the British and the Americans and said, look, we don't want Nelson Mandela to have these nuclear weapons. You don't want him to have these nuclear weapons. Will you buy them off us? And they said, yes, okay. 6 of them were sold to the United States government, and my colleague, the person I'm talking to, was involved in shipping those warheads to the US where they were dismantled. That leaves 3. The 3 other nuclear warheads were sold to a consortium of top Tory grandees, basically the major faction of the Tory party. And what all of these people have got in common, according to my contact, is that they all went to that school for scoundrels, Eton College. Now, what they did is they bought these 3 nuclear weapons. They set up a private company called Astra Holdings, which was headed up by a former MI6 guy called Stefan Koch. And they bought these nuclear weapons from the, basically under the table from the South Africans for cash. And then they sold them on to the British government for a profit. Yeah? So they all made, the Conservative Party itself got £17.8 million for its 1992 election campaign, and individual Tories, William Waldegrave, Michael Heseltine, Peter Lilly, there's a list, they all got paid off. Then they moved, this deal was actually set up by a small group of people who went to South Africa in 1989, 1990, and in that group was Sir Kenneth Warren, who is a very senior Tory fixer, Dr. David Kelly, who was Britain's top weapons specialist, and a young man who was working at Central Office at the time, who was a very much an up-and-coming character, one David Cameron. And they set up this deal. They moved the 3 weapons to Oman in the Middle East, which is a British protectorate. The SAS fought a big battle against communist insurgents there in the 1970s, so they're very much a kind of British puppet state, really. And then David Kelly was flown out from Britain to check that the weapons were there. But they were dealing with a guy called John Bredenkamp, who's based in Zimbabwe, who's an extremely dodgy ex-Rhodesian SAS character. And he basically had sold the weapons on, so they lost them. And it's like doing a coke deal in New York. You know, you give them 50 grand for the coke, and you say, well, where's the coke? And they go, what coke? What are you going to do? Call the cops? I mean, these guys have got balls of steel. Yeah, they're able to double cross the baddest guys on the planet. They're that bad that they can double cross them. I'm also getting information, because my contact was also involved in this, that in 1991 the Americans lost 8 plutonium bombs, which they dropped off a B-52 in the sea off Somalia. And they were recovered by another ex-Rhodesian SAS guy called Billy Reutenbach. Now, both Bredenkamp and Reutenbach and Sir Ken Warren all live in Somerset, within a few miles of each other. Now, we're getting loads more information about this, but I think this is the audience where I want to talk about this. I'm not going to give you the name of the officer we spoke to a few years ago, because that's secret. I'm not going to give you the name of the guy I'm working with now on the film, because that's secret. And I'm not going to give you the name of the guy that's told me all this stuff about the nuclear weapons. But it does check out. Everything that he's told me that I've checked out checks out. The Tory party did indeed get 17.8 million quid in 1992. It's in Hansard because Labour MP Doug Hoyle was tipped off by Tara Biggs-Davidson, who was also one of the ones involved. She's a daughter of Sir John Biggs-Davidson, and she was actually a secretary, and she was copying all of this stuff up. She actually had a beef with Peter Lilly, who had given her a sexually transmitted disease. So she basically tipped off Doug Hoyle to ask the question. And he did ask the question, where did you get that £17.8 million from? And the Tories just went, flim, flam, and go to Company's House. Now, I've got a radio show in Bristol. It's an FM radio show. It's not my show, it's Tony's show, Tony Gosling's show, but I'm on it most weeks. And we do cover these topics, and if you want to find it, it's all archived, our show. It's on www.thisweek.org. Okay, I've given some people cards, but I haven't got masses of cards with me. www.thisweek.org, and there's a 2-hour show every week, and it's all archived there the last 2.5, 3 years. We do cover everything to do with politics in Bristol, so we have lots of MPs and councillors on. We talk about the national economy, we talk about local issues, the buses, and we also talk about missing nuclear weapons, etc., etc. And we have got quite a following, not just in Bristol. I think I've probably said enough to whet your appetites there. But the point about reinvestigate 9/11 is we perceive of ourselves, I think Ian will back me up on this, as we're trying to be a super professional lobbying organisation. Yeah, we're not just a place to come and chat. We do organise events like this, but what we're really trying to do is influence the real people at the top. Because I think ultimately we're going to have to talk to people like the army and the police and say, look, get your finger out. You've got a job to do. That's what we pay you for. Mm.